All right, I'm here today to talk a little bit about procrastination, including how to understand it and possibly even how to overcome it at least sometimes. So, to be clear, I am in no way, shape, or form a perfectly organized, fabulously productive, non-procrastinating human being, not even a little bit. In fact, part of my idea of putting this information together and making a video like this is because this is stuff that I'm still learning how to do for myself. But I think that understanding it is helpful, and it helps me understand it better to be able to teach it to anyone out there who's interested. So while I'm working on this and you're working on this, let's work on it together. If I have strategies that work well for you, let me know. Drop a comment. If you have strategies that I have not mentioned that have worked great, let me know. Maybe I'll make more videos of future strategies. It'll be great. All right. So first of all, let's talk about what procrastination is, and then importantly, what it isn't. So when you define procrastination, actually look up the definition. You get the act of delaying or postponing something, which could mean almost anything. And then more specifically, it's often to put off intentionally and habitually. So here's the thing with this, is it makes it really feel a lot like procrastination is specifically you choosing not to do something. I think it is important to say that I don't think that's mostly true. And here's a couple of the reasons why. First of all, let's talk about what procrastination definitely is not. It's not procrastination if you can't get things done because you have more to do than you have time to do it in. It's just not. You've got to at least stop and figure out if you have the time to get things done, and then say, well, if I can get all of these things done, am I choosing not to do them in that time? And that's very different from having too much to do. It's not procrastination if you don't have what you need to complete a task. So if you are avoiding a task because you literally have not been given the right information, you don't know what tool to use, you don't have something that you need to find that first. So you might be procrastinating asking that question, but you're not procrastinating the task itself. Finally, it's not procrastination if you are actually working beyond your physical and mental limits. So when I say literally having more than you can do, in some cases, having more than you can do is more than you can do based on limits that you have. So could I work in my evenings to do extra stuff and get things done? Do I have the time? Sure, I could not do some of my relaxation, or I could choose to not sleep as much. But would that be a smart move for my physical and mental health? Probably not. And so if I'm going beyond those limits, it's also not procrastination. And then finally, it's not procrastination if you just forgot about it. And then as soon as you remember, you're willing to do it. That's another whole video that we can have talking about how ADHD people forget things, but not this one. All right, so what is procrastination? The reality of procrastination is that it's actually a protective mechanism. It really comes down to some complex psychology that relates to us really actually wanting to do things well or correctly and not have them blow up in our faces and our bodies going, wait a second, what if this one does? That's one of the things that happens with procrastination. Another thing is that it can be trouble with executive dysfunction. So a lot of aspects of procrastination come down to figuring out what to do, what steps to do them in, knowing where to start. And a lot of that is related to executive functioning. And then there is some aspect in procrastination of difficulty processing time, as in you think you have enough time to get things done, and then you realize that you don't. And so you say, well, I can get to that later. Not necessarily because you don't want to do it, but because it is hard to put together what later means, what now means, and how much space it's going to take to get something done. And a lot of these also back relate to a lot of the problems people with ADHD have. So you're going to see a fair amount of overlap in some of the things that are related to procrastination and some of the things I've talked about related to ADHD. So I'm going to go through a couple of the major common causes of procrastination and some of the things you can do to defeat them. So most likely your procrastination falls into one or more of these categories, and being able to figure out which one can really help you find ways to not procrastinate as much. So we have activation versus motivation, perfectionism, fear of consequences, and executive function deficiency. So activation versus motivation. People love to talk about motivation. Motivation is the reason you do something, right? It's why. It's your great big why. Except that while motivation seems like a really important thing, you often have to overcome a mountain of, but you need to start to get to motivation. Motivation, that feeling of, I know why I want to do this and can keep it going, is not always sufficient to actually activate you to do the thing. And very often, motivation is actually something that comes that once you get started, you realize, oh, no, I really do like this thing and I can keep going. And so thinking about it as if I were just motivated enough, I'd be able to start is the wrong way to think. What you want to think about is, well, what are some things I can do to essentially trick myself into starting? And then I'll become motivated as I go. So how to help with this? Well, activation is often about creating the right environment. So depending on what you're attempting to accomplish, maybe the right environment is quiet. Maybe the right environment actually is a little bit noisy. Maybe the right environment is at home. Maybe it's at work. It doesn't matter what it has to be for you, but you need to know what it is that puts you in that spot where it's good and easy to do the work you need to do. Start with teeny tiny things that are very, very obvious. So it helps to activate if you know you can just get over one tiny piece and what that tiny piece is. So I have students a lot of times who have very much difficulty writing papers. And I find that the big reason they have difficulty writing papers is that they literally can't get their brains around starting it. And so I'll very often say, well, the first thing you could do is just make an outline. What are the vague ideas you want to go through? That's a tiny thing. It's something that's pretty clear. Then once you have a vague outline of what things you want to do, then you can start adding pieces to it. That's how you get into it, and that's how you turn activation into motivation. You really want to work on process, not product. If you have to complete something, that's when that protective mechanism of, I cannot possibly complete this, maybe I just shouldn't do it at all, can kick in. But if you just have to work on it for 20 minutes, you can often make it happen. I'll tell you, I'm a runner and I'm a distance runner. I run a lot of half marathons and I've run 2 marathons. And as a runner, especially one who's done marathons, if you have to think about the fact that I'm going to eventually run 26 miles when you start this thing, you'll never make it 26 miles. Your brain cannot even comprehend that idea. But if you're like, I can go a mile and I can go 2 miles and I can go 3 because I've done a 5K before. And then I can keep going and I can get to 6 because I have done a 10K before. And you eventually add it up and soon you're at mile 23 and you're like, well, oh crap, I can always do 3 more miles to get to the end. You'll eventually get there. Start with something small. If you can't do 20 minutes, do 5. If it is such crazy nonsense that you can't do 5, do 1. You almost always end up doing more than you started thinking about. Use rewards, but don't go too crazy with the rewards because you do want a little bit of intrinsic motivation, which is you wanting to do something. And if you shift gears so that you only do something because you get something external, it does become less interesting, and there's good science showing that. But sometimes a reward to at least get over the activation hump is worthwhile. So my sister used to use this website called Written Kitten, where if you wrote 100 words, it showed you a picture of a kitten. If you like that kind of thing, it's totally useful. All right. So those are ways to help activate you. So now we can move on to the second common cause of procrastination, which is perfectionism. Perfect is the enemy of the good. There's a lot of people who, if it can't be perfect, won't do it at all, won't hand something in, won't be able to complete it. And this is that protective mechanism. This is your brain going, wait a second, it's a problem, I'm going to damage it, therefore I shouldn't try. And it's not that you're saying those things consciously to yourself. You're probably not. But those are the internal reactions that slow you down when you look at something and go, well, if I can't get it right, I'm not even convinced I should start to work on it. All right, so here's my deal, recovering perfectionists. You are not defined by your work, your productivity, your accomplishment, things like that. I promise you are a perfectly reasonable human being, even if you have a little trouble getting things done. And if that thing that you turn in has a couple of errors in it, you are not in error. Everything has errors. That's the way life is. So if that's a thing you needed to hear today, great. It can help you to really directly, if you realize this is you, redefine failure, aim for a growth mindset, and really start thinking about, okay, I'm going to do something and it's not going to be right the first time, and I'm going to make it better. If you recognize that nothing is going to be right the first time, then you will do a good job of improving. And in fact, it can be worthwhile to really actually plan external check-ins where you ask somebody to look at what you're doing, or that you're going to show them your progress at actual progression points, not at the end point, but at 50%, at 75%, at 90%. So you know it's not done yet, but you want them to take a look at it. I do this with my students a lot where I say, this thing is a draft. It's only one step, and I plan to give you feedback and have you improve upon it. And I can get lots more students to give me a draft or an outline or a piece of something than a whole product, and then you're one more step towards the product. Do a values check-in with yourself. What's actually important to you? Is it the fact that you need to get everything exactly right, or do you value in other people their ability to grow, their ability to listen, our ability to work together as a community? If those are things you value elsewhere, consider valuing them in yourself as well. That will really help you as a recovering perfectionist. This one is not so much me, but I've known a lot of people like this over the years, and I've worked with them, and I promise these strategies help. All right. Now we're getting closer to the ones that describe me in other ways. This one can be a shockingly big deal. The fear of consequences that goes along with this idea of the wall of awful. So I want to direct you, and you can see on this screen, there's a video you can see, but you can also hear Brendan Mahana on a number of podcasts. He runs ADHD Essentials. He's been interviewed by other people, talk about the wall of awful. It's a thing that happens when you're constantly experiencing negativity of some kind. So you try to do something and it doesn't go well. And because it doesn't go well, what Brendan says is that you're building a metaphorical wall. And though every time something goes wrong, that wall gets another brick in it. And it doesn't just get a brick for something going wrong. It gets a brick because you feel bad about yourself, because you let other people down, because you feel the shame of being a bad person for that. And you just keep building it up. And if this happens over and over again, and so this is where the ADHD crossover comes in, is very common in people with ADHD who are constantly making small mistakes, messing things up, being concerned about it, and getting bad feedback, it eventually heads up. And here's the problem with the wall. It's hard to get around. It's a metaphorical wall. So as Brendan says, it goes on forever. You can't go around it. So you have to get through it, or you have to get over it. And you can try to punch your way through it like, fine, I hate you and I'll just do the stupid thing. But it doesn't really help you overcome the idea of procrastination. And it may help you in one situation, but maybe not in the future. There are things that you can do, however. I'm not going to play the video because I want to play a video in another video, so you'll have to go check Brendan out yourself. But here's some of the things he says about how to work with a wall of awful. You can climb it, which can mean that you become aware that it exists, be aware of how tall it is, and be aware of the fact that these things make you feel badly and can slow you down. It takes a little bit of work, but it's doable. However, there's also things you can do to help you get up the wall. You can also find ways to cut out a door through the wall. Give yourself handholds to help you get over it. Some of that involves things like changing your emotional state. If you've gotten to the point where every time you start to do something, oh my God, it brings up all of these feelings and you get real nervous about it, what can you do to bring that down again? I am awful at things like kitchen cleaning, getting large amounts of dishes done, doing laundry, folding laundry. I just feel like everything takes so long and it's so boring and I absolutely despise it. And so what I will do is I will grab my headphones and I will play a podcast. Because I like a podcast and it calms me down and I know I can enjoy that while I'm doing it and it won't be as boring. And that's the way I get myself through whatever it is. And then I realize that I don't actually hate doing the dishes or folding the laundry. I just get very nervous about it and how long it's going to take and how boring it's going to be. And then I feel better once I do that external thing and I know I can move forward with it. So those are definitely the things you can. You can also change the environment. So this tends to be a sort of good one for my students, is that if you've constantly had trouble getting work done in one place or you're having trouble studying in one way, go somewhere else. Go to the learning commons, go to the library, change your location, make an appointment with a tutor, even if you're not sure if they can help you with certain things. Sometimes, let me tell you, this is a thing I have been doing with my therapist. Sometimes all I need is someone who is like, why don't you sit down right now and figure out all the tasks on your task list? And as soon as I do that with somebody else there, it's like, oh, I can make that work. Another thing to remember out of Wall of Awful is it's built when you think you've failed something, which is, again, a big key to procrastination is thinking you have failed or will fail. So if you reframe that and say, okay, trying it and messing up is not the problem, you can move forward. All right. And fear of consequences, I think, lends itself somewhat into some of the things that relate to executive function deficiency, because to execute on these things, you have to be able to put a lot of the pieces that I've already talked about together. And the moment you screw them up is when the Wall of Awful starts to come in. And so knowing that these are the things that give you trouble might be enough to help start to break down or find your way through the Wall of Awful around the tasks that you procrastinate. So let's talk about what executive functioning is. There's actually a lot of different ways to describe it, but it is essentially something that occurs in the frontal lobes of our brain, right up over here, and helps us get things done. There's a lot of different pieces to it. They get broken down in different ways depending on how you look at it and who you talk to. But here are some key ones. It includes activating, so that's that thing we've already talked about. Breaking things into parts, so being able to take something big and say, I'm only going to do a piece of it, is actually an executive function. Knowing what to do first is an executive function. And it's a pretty hard one sometimes to be like, wait a second, what is step one to this thing? Knowing how to start. So even if you can figure out what step one is, knowing what physical action to take to accomplish that goal is not always something that is easy for people to understand. And then staying on task, not being distracted by other things, and being able to actually focus on something is an executive function. So there's a bunch of things you can do to help with various aspects of executive functioning. So let's talk about a few of them. 1, aim for action steps. Action steps have clear process. They take a defined amount of time, and an action step consists of only one thing. And anything bigger than that is a project. So let's go back to the action step concept for a moment. This is something I think people don't think about, is that a lot of things really take multiple steps. So one of the things I still have some trouble with, but I'm getting better at, is responding to certain types of emails. They tend to be emails asking for information, or emails that involve then back emailing a large group of people or providing more details to something. And here's what I've learned is that an email should be something that has a single action step, right? Hit reply, type, send. But in reality, many of them require me to do 2 or 3 things before I would ever get to the hit reply, type, send. And I actually need to take a moment and stop and go, wait, what do I need to do with this email? What pieces of information do I need? When can I get them? What's the process of doing that? How do I put them into the email, and who gets included in my send list? Getting that stuff together and realizing that it's actually 5 or 6 actions to get to an email, and then therefore it's actually more of a project than an action, is sometimes enough for me to be like, okay, wait a second. This is bigger than I was expecting. But if I map it out, I can do it rather than just letting it sit in the email or sit in my to-do list forever and not get done. So knowing that a lot of my things are actually projects and not actions is important. I still have many things that are projects on my to-do list, but I try to add to them this thing, here's the first action or a couple of actions that I will do, and then keep adding them as I go. Once you have a project, laying out the action steps in order is actually key. Knowing what those steps are and how it's going to get you to a finish point is important. Checking that when you write out those action steps, that they make sense and that you know what you need to accomplish each one. So if you are writing a paper, so this is again my students, and your action step is to do research, do you know where you're going for that? Do you know what database you're heading for? Do you know what search terms you're going to type in? If not, you need to figure those things out as an action before you do research. Do research is a pretty tough action. All right, more tips for executing. Preparing your environment is still a big deal. Being able to make sure that you have the space that you need is absolutely important. That can include things like getting rid of your distractions. If you know you're going to look at your phone, it's got to go away for some period of time. Have a plan for impulsive distractions. I'm very much a person who thinks of something and then sidetracks themselves. And I've been trying very hard that when I think of something, it goes somewhere. Some people like Post-it notes. It goes on this Post-it and it goes to the side and then you look at it later. Or a quick list of, I'm going to type this over here. I now have a task list in most of my places. If I think of something, I try to put it on the task list and get to it later when my calendar says, go back to my tasks. It's not easy to do, but sometimes you just need to do it. And sometimes you need to even make a note that says, these are the things you should be working on, these things you should not be working on, and make sure you stick to it. So write them, remove them, get them out of your way. Have a time frame. So this is that activating part. If you know you're going to work for 20 minutes, it's great to actually just work for 20 minutes because you will be able to be focused in that period of time, knowing that an endpoint is coming. And I really say do something like set a timer. Take your phone, set a noisy timer on it for some period of time, put it in a bag so you can't see it or hear it until the one noisy timer comes up. Make sure everything else on it is silenced. I do this with my computer too. So my prepare my environment and having a time frame tends to come from a sort of background noise generator that I have. And it creates a background noise for a period of time, and then it dings and shuts off the noise. And that's how I know that I can work. I need to work with something in my ears because silence makes my whole brain turn in 17 directions and go, wait, what's happening? All right, so now's the part where you get something done, which is try to figure out what your procrastination issues are and try some of these strategies. These certainly aren't all of the strategies you'd ever use, but hey, everything is useful. So think of something you commonly procrastinate about and think about why you do it. Do you have trouble activating? Do you have trouble with perfectionism? Are you fearful of what kinds of consequences might happen if it isn't quite right, or what could happen if you do it or don't do it? Or do you have some of the executive function issues where you're not sure what to do, what steps to take? Once you figure out what those things are, now you have some ideas to go back and say, what might you try the next time? Small pieces, tiny chunks, action steps. Honestly, that'll get you through a lot of things. So hopefully you learned something. If so, leave me a comment. If you have any ideas, leave more comments. We'll start a whole thing. It'd be great. Thanks again.